All right, cool. I want to rock and roll. So I hope that, like I said, I hope we actually get a few more people in here because this is really important. But if we don't, you guys are the oracles that will carry this message throughout all of the different communities from whence you came. It's actually interesting because we have some fairly core people from the Drupal community right here. We have a guy back there that looks awful lot like the guy who is the core developer of Laravel. So I think I'm right about that. Actually, I know I'm right about that. So this will actually be kind of fun. And I guess I come from the Symfony world, so I can give a little background about that kind of stuff. So you all thought you were wandering into the last session, last normal session, but in fact, you guys were wandering into a journey of great proportions, a journey to the center of the tools that we use. And I am your friendly guide. My name is Ryan, by the way. I'm your friendly guide from the Symfony community, and as you'll see, it doesn't matter if I come from the Symfony community or the Drupal community or the Laravel community, because all of this at the core is going to be very much the same. Let's see here. Also about me, I don't know why I'm stumbling through this part. This is who I am. I'm also writing for KnpUniversity.com, which does PHP and Symfony screencasts, so check that out. And most importantly, and she is here, but I think almost everybody in the room knows you at this point, I'm the husband of the much braver traveler and guide. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me. Leanna in the back there. I don't know if you've met Taylor. You guys, Taylor, that's Leanna. Leanna, that's Taylor. So if you haven't met her, you should meet her. She's very, very friendly. So let's get into this. A great journey begins to the center of the kernel and back. And what I want to talk about is, so let's get right into it, is we all know, it doesn't matter what we basically do. We always start with the request. We always end with the response. This is true in Drupal. It's true in, if you're doing something in Java, it's true in flat PHP. It's true in Laravel. So we know that we already have this set up. So this is us kind of going from the crust of the earth. We have a request, we have question, 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 and we have a response. And then, of course, we have down here eternal glory if we can make it through that far. So as we're kind of making this journey through the center of our framework, because right here, this is our framework. Whether you're thinking, whether you're a WordPress developer or a Drupal developer or whatever you are, this right here is your framework. Something's happening here. This is sort of magic land. And historically, every framework does it a different way. So this magic here is completely different in WordPress as it is from Drupal, and that's true. But historically, even like Symfony and everything else is completely different from everywhere else. So this is the journey we're taking down here. And we're going to ride the request into the framework like a passenger. But the request can't bring us back. Once we get to the core, we're going to need to create a response and ride that back out of the framework and see what happens. So also along the way, if your framework gives you this request response thing, you're also going to have hook points. And again, it doesn't matter what world you're from. You like when I say the word hook or event, you should be thinking, yes, I use WordPress, or I use Drupal. I have this idea of hooks to hook into different processes. So this is another thing we're going to be watching out for, is there's these hooks as we're riding the request through like the deep core of parts. Where are these hooks and how do these hooks work? So let's start the journey. We're still up top here in question, question, question land. We don't know what's happening inside of the core of whatever technology we happen to be using. So I'm going to show you Silex. And I might do this because I thought this might happen. Better? Yes. Presenter's best thing, Googling what the hotkey is for inverting your colors before your presentation. How many of you guys have used Silex? I think most people in this room. Okay, yeah, it's kind of the easiest. It's a micro framework. It's the easiest one to kind of understand and look at. And it's one of the ones that we're talking about today. So the first thing is, again, if you are a Symfony or a Silex developer, I almost want you to think of, or a Laravel developer, I also want you to think of not that. Imagine you're a Drupal developer, something more complicated than that. Because everything I'm going to be saying applies to, at least on a philosophical level, to tools beyond what our custom frameworks normally are. So I'm doing this in kind of a custom framework land, but think like, is that really the same in Drupal? Or philosophically, is that the same in WordPress? Because it kind of is. So the first thing we always do is basically specify a URL. We call this a route. I think most people in here have used a framework before, so you're familiar with that term. We have a route. And this route here matches /hello/anything. And of course, if the user goes to something that matches that, it's going to call that function. This is the basis of every single framework. If you're talking with somebody that has not used a framework before, like this is the point that I want you to get across. So like I said, you guys are kind of the oracles to carry that message forward. But this is not too complicated for us. So we have the route, we have the controller. The controller is just a function, and that's how things work. And then what do we do inside of that controller? We build the page. So one way or another, we're going to build a page. If we're inside of Drupal, then probably the page is being built by looking up some content in the database and putting it together and adding some theme stuff. But there's eventually a function somewhere that actually builds the page. So, might switch back. Oops. Sorry, I'm going to get us back and forth so we can actually see these. So we started with the request. So we've gone like one layer slightly deeper, right? This was the question before. And now we know that there's sort of a routing layer and sort of a controller layer that's happening. Something that determines what page we're on, something that builds that page. A little bit of extra detail. And we also know that we still want to have those hook points inside of there. Somehow that's got to happen. It's not terribly obvious with Silex how that happens, because we have the route and we have the controller, but it's not really obvious yet, because it's a big black hole how we hook into that process. We understand the route, we understand the controller, we do not understand the crazy beast that is actually driving the traffic to match the route and call the controller and all that kind of stuff. So the core is still totally a mystery to us. So let's go a little bit deeper. There we go. I can't miss out on all my dinosaur references there. So let's go a little bit deeper to the upper mantle. So again, we've looked at Silex before. This is the classic hello world. We'll say it's not a hello world. Let's say this is a hello dinosaur, because we're going to go to /hello/dinosaur. This is our classic hello dinosaur page. This is how it looks in Silex. Again, I want to focus on the fact that we have a route with this format. We have a controller, and the controller builds the page. 1, 2, 3. OK, so this is what Laravel looks like. And to be fair, because I have to do a disclaimer because we have a Laravel person in the room and Drupal people in the room, there's in both technologies, there's different ways to do things. This is probably the most common way you see things done in Laravel, but like anything else, there are other ways to do it. But what I want to do here is kind of like see how close things are. We have get /hello/curly brace name. We have the exact same thing here, /hello/curly brace name. It's a function. The name is even passed to that function just like Silex, and lo and behold, return the same darn thing inside of there. Symfony, same thing. It's all the same concepts, just mixed up in different ways. We have the route here, /hello/curly brace name. Yes, we're living in a class here. It's not like an anonymous function. But it's still a function that we can call. The name is passed there. And the only difference so far is we're returning a new response object. So Symfony has a response object. It's part of a component called HTTP Foundation. It gives you a request and a response object. In Symfony, you're returning that response object, but it's basically just a string or a wrapper around the string. So kind of like basically the exact same thing once again. And this is how it looks in Drupal 8. Up here, we have a YAML file. And again, we have the path /hello/curly brace name. And then below there, we basically specify our controller. Again, there are slightly different ways to do this. But our controller kind of gets this special key called _content. And you notice this is just a function name, a class name, and then a function name. And down here, we have that class, we have that function, and this is actually verbatim copy and pasted from my previous slide. This is just how it looks inside of Symfony. It's the exact same thing. There's some extra layers we're going to talk about in a second, but it's all the same thing. So at this point, we have the routing, which is identical. This is really cool for me as a Symfony developer, because when I started doing, I've spoken at several Drupal conferences now, which is crazy because I don't do Drupal or haven't done Drupal in the past. And it's really easy for me to understand Drupal and to make custom pages in Drupal because it's the exact same thing that I'm used to doing. So we have the same routing system, because we can see it's exactly the same. We have the same system where our page is built by a controller function, and we have the same system where we are returning a response. Or maybe not, right? Because if you remember Silex and Laravel, you're just able to return a string. But talk about that next. So our goal is always to create that response. Again, if we're using Java or using WordPress, because we need to send the response back to the user. So this is what our goal is. Can anybody tell me what framework or what language this response came from? No, yeah, because this is agnostic to everything. So this could be Java, this could be flat PHP, this could be Drupal, this could be anything, because we can't actually tell, because it's always coming back as the same thing. This is like a really nice poetic thing, because I don't know anything, or I don't know much about Java, and Java people probably don't know much about PHP, but in the end, we're always returning the same thing, so we have something in common. And this is true inside the PHP world. We're all kind of doing the same job. We just do it, historically, we do it in very, very different ways. So in Symfony, our job is to return a response. So we quite literally return Symfony's response object. What's in the response object? Nothing more than content and headers, which is what you're always returning back from your application. So Symfony gives us a nice response object. We return that directly from our controller. Very straightforward. Drupal 8, I'm not even going to talk about it. Exact same response object. Okay? Silex is where things start to get weird. This is not a response object. It kind of muddies the water. So does Silex have like a different system for kind of creating the page? And the answer is actually no. This here, so before I had a string, now I'm returning a new response object. And you notice that's also Symfony's response object. So if you return a string, Silex just has a nice little hook in there. Remember those hooks that we're talking about that we haven't actually discovered yet? One of those hooks says, did the controller return a string? Oh, that's okay. I'll just put it in a Symfony response object for you. So at the end of Silex, you're also returning a response object. If you want to, you can return a response object from a Silex controller. So as you might guess, Laravel is the exact same way. So you might see something like this, return hello space dot name. There's also some other ways you can return pages. But ultimately, it just has a layer that says, is that a response I got back? Because if it's not, just put it in a response. So you can do something like this. Here's the catch. Of course, it's not actually a catch, which is fantastic. You'll notice this is not Symfony's response object. This is Laravel's response object. But that extends Symfony's response object. So in reality, it's the exact same thing over again. In fact, you can do this inside of Laravel. You can actually go and create a Symfony response object instead of a Laravel response object. One of the key things in Laravel is it's just a lot of Symfony objects subclassed with extra helpers on there. And if you strip away those helpers, like if you actually didn't use a lot of the helpers in Laravel, you would get something that started to look more and more like Symfony. Like this looks exactly like a Symfony controller looks. So we have the same routing system. We have actually the same end goal, the same response object. So if I only know Symfony and you ask me, Ryan, how do you add a header to a response in Drupal, at least from a philosophical level, I already know how to do it because I already know how to do it inside of Symfony. So in every framework, except for Laravel, sort of, you'll hear me say that a lot, but there's always a caveat of sort of, because it's not different in Laravel either. In every framework, you create the response, and you say response, arrow, headers, arrow, add, key, value, there's your header. Laravel is a little bit different, not really, because you can just say response, arrow, header, and give it the key, value pair. Anybody have a guess on what that's doing behind the scenes? Yeah, it's just a proxy. It's a shortcut. Remember, because it's a subclass. It's just a shortcut to this up there. And there are also, again, this is another thing with Laravel, is there are also like, sometimes there's multiple ways to do things. There's multiple ways to set headers or build pages. Again, they're all behind the scenes proxying back to something that we're familiar with, if you're familiar with Symfony or Drupal 8. So, and I'll see more examples of this. So we have the same response. We have the same routes. And as you can probably guess, we have the same request. So we're starting with the request, we're ending with the response, and even the request is exactly the same. So here, what we're going to do here is very simple. We're going to look for a query parameter called ending, literally the word ending. And we're just going to print that out in our hello world message. So again, every framework except for Laravel, which is actually really great because it actually drives down the point even more, because Laravel does things slightly different, but then you can say, surprise, but it's not actually any different. So in every framework, so Drupal 8, Symfony, and Silex, getting the request looks like this. First of all, you get the request object. One of the ways to do that in all three of those things is to type hint it, basically as an argument. As soon as you type hint your controller to have a request argument, the framework knows to pass you the request object. And that kind of makes sense, because our controller is what builds the page, so it kind of makes sense that we can get the request as an argument, and then we use the request information, the query parameters, whatever, to help create the response. So we get the request, and then for query parameters, we say request, arrow query, arrow get, and then this is ending, and this is even a default value. So again, very straightforward. Every framework's going to have something similar that looks like this. This is going to work in Silex, Symfony, and Drupal 8. So why is Laravel being difficult? It's not. It just looks like this. Request : input. It's a facade. I mean, it's a facade. I was like, am I really going to be able to say the word facade on stage? It's a facade. It's a facade. So how many people, Taylor, you can't raise your hand because I already know the answer. How many people are familiar with Laravel Facades? Okay, good. Yeah, not many people. And Taylor, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is fairly simple. And we're going to talk about services in a second. But basically, this looks like a static call. It's not actually a static call. I mean, of course, it's a static call. That's a static call in PHP. But this is a proxy back to the request object. And then it calls the non-static input method on it. So this is what we see. Behind the scenes, Laravel has some magic to proxy it to that. What is the request arrow input method? That's actually a shortcut method added to Laravel's request, because Laravel has its own request, which extends the normal request. And it just goes out and does the exact same thing that we do in everything else. So again, it looks different, but it's actually not different. It's just a layer of magic going on there, but it's still the same request object. All right, excellent. So now we're going to go one step deeper. We have request, we have the response, they're the same. We kind of know we have the routing and controller is the same, but that's still totally a mystery. Who calls the routing? Who executes the routing? Who actually calls the controller? Who's doing those types of layers? And the answer is this very, very scary, frightening thing right here called HTTP kernel. You may never want to dive or read into this. So if you give me like the next 10 minutes of your attention, I'm going to pack you full of how this works and kind of empower you to basically be really dangerous in all these technologies. And then you'll never have to dive back into this class if you don't want to. So this is a framework. This is all of the code. So this is like index.php of one of these frameworks. So this is all of the code. There's nothing else hiding. And you can see we create a request. We pass a request to some handle function on some object. We don't know what it is. We're not familiar with it. But request goes into handle. Handle gives us a response. Okay, so remember that pattern. By the way, which framework is this? Yeah, this is Symfony. Yeah. So this is Symfony. So this is a different framework here, where in index.php, there's a line that says app run. And then somewhere, if you kind of like run down and find where that run object is, it's actually the same thing. Create a request object, pass this to some function called handle. So like, wait a second, we just saw that same pattern a second ago. I don't know what that handle function is, but it looks familiar. And that gives us back a response object. And this one is Silex, yep. Silex. This is a giveaway. So this is another one. The top 5 lines there are basically from the index.php file. So let's trace through Drupal handle request. I'm not even going to go through it because you already know where I'm going. Request object, handle method, response. Same thing. That's Drupal. And of course, we all know what this one's going to be. This is the same thing. And of course, I'm summarizing a few things. If you open the core, you'll have to trace a few layers to find these types of things. But we have index.php of app arrow run. Creates a request, passes this to a handle function, returns a response. So what is this mystical beast that's at the center of all of this? It's Symfony's HTTP kernel component, which is, of course, a fancy word for a library. It's just a small PHP library that's used by all of those different frameworks. Well, whatever you want to call them, frameworks, CMSs. The lines are getting blurred, which is a really nice thing. So when you look at that handle function, and by the way, let me fast forward and then rewind. Laravel is going to be a little bit of the odd child here, but not in a bad way, because it's actually going to teach us some extra stuff. But when we look at that handle function, it's actually a concrete class called HTTP kernel inside of that component. So for Symfony, Silex, and Drupal, which are very different things, especially when you look at Silex versus Drupal. Silex is this tiny little thing. Drupal is actually a full content management system. All of those totally get built from request to response. That whole cycle happens in exactly the same function. How is that possible? How can we have one function, which by the way is only like 30 or 40 lines long, that actually is able to power those two systems and do everything inside those systems that are so incredibly different? So HTTP kernel handle, this is the handle function. We're actually going to walk through that. It's not going to be nearly as scary as you guys think, because there's really not that much to it. So again, to back up, we're starting at the request. We're going to determine the controller. We're going to call the controller, and we're going to basically send the response back. We already know this flow. We've seen this about 50 slides so far. The key thing is, inside of this handle function, there's going to be events. So whatever world you come from, think of hooks. The events, like hook systems, have names. So there's going to be an event that happens right here, a hook. Its name is called kernel.request. That means basically if you want to have a function called at that level, you will tell the core of your framework, I want to have my function called when the kernel.request event happens. So it's very much like any other hook system. And then there's another one called kernel.controller between these, and another one called kernel.response down here. There's actually a couple other events that are that I'm not showing up here as well. So let's look at Symfony and Silex. That's what that says, but I'm going to keep it dark so we can see. So what happens with Symfony and Silex inside of this function? First thing, and you're going to see the slide 3 more times for Drupal and for Laravel, we start with the request. And the request is Symfony's request object, and it's always that same thing. Of course, Laravel has a subclass, but that's just for adding helper functions. Second, an event is fired. So this is our first hook point. So nothing has happened inside your framework. An event is fired. The event's called kernel.request. Inside of Symfony and Silex, there's one important listener to that. So basically, the framework is set up and said, like, when that event happens, call this class called router listener. So there's kind of a hook that's built in at the core. What does router listener do? Router listener is actually what executes the routing. And there's 2 important things it does. First, it kind of goes through all, so this is Silex here, but I could have done Symfony. It goes through all of your routes to figure out which of those routes matches. Once it finds out which route matches, what does it do with that? What it does is it takes your controller function and pushes it onto the request object. And this should look a little bit abstract, but this is very important. So basically it determines if this route matched, then I'm going to set this underscore controller thing. By the way, this request attribute is just a random spot on Symfony's request object to store garbage that you want to store. Doesn't do anything, it's just a storage place. So if this one matches here, if this route matches here, it's going to store that anonymous function on the underscore controller key. And that's it. It just stashes it there. That's the job of the routing layer, and that's it. And then it gets out. After this, we have another event, kernel.controller. Nobody important listens to that. You guys can hook into that if you want to, but it doesn't matter. You know, what's cool about this is when I say you guys can hook into that, like I'm talking about if you understand how to hook into this kernel.controller event, then you understand how to hook into Symfony, Silex, and Drupal, because they all have this exact same event that happens at the exact same time in the process. So what happens after this, so we had that event, nobody important's listening. After that, we just call the function. So we ran the routing, we get that underscore controller key back out, and we just call that function. Cool, and what does the function return? We write the function. What does the function return? Function returns a response object. And then the last step, well, okay, there's one more event called kernel.response, which nobody important listens to as far as the framework goes, but you guys can hook into. And then the response is actually set. So the headers are sent and the content is echoed. Cool? So that right there, you guys, if you've never used Silex or Symfony, you are now kind of in the 99th percentile of understanding what happens at the core. It's just a few events. One of the event fires the router listener, and then there's another layer that picks up that underscore controller key that the router figured out and just calls that function. And that's it. There's a lot of other little layers there, but they're all kind of magic, extra, optional features. So let's look at Drupal. This is one of my favorite ones to go through. It says Drupal there. I'm going to keep it inverted, color inverted, so we can see it. So, same slide as earlier, request, because we always start with the exact same request object. Next, exact same first event. It fires kernel.request. Exact same thing that happened inside of Symfony and Silex. Now there are 3 different important listeners. In fact, there's many listeners, but there's 3 important listeners. So we're going to kind of go through these in order. They all do one tiny little thing, so they're not underwhelming. First thing is this path subscriber. So basically, early on inside of Drupal, there's this class that's called. And what the path subscriber basically does is it looks at the URL, so /hello/php world, and looks up in a table called URL alias and says, is this an aliased page? Because if you've never used Drupal before, one of the things you can do is create a page. And by default, like it has a URL like /node/5. And then you can say, no, I want this URL to this page to be like /hello/php world. And when you do that, it just inserts a row into this URL alias table and kind of says when they go to /hello/php world, it's actually a map to the node 5. So that's what this listener does. It basically looks this up. And again, there's that attributes, request attributes thing, which doesn't do anything. It's just a place to stash stuff. Drupal stashes the system path thing that says they're going here, but in reality, I want it to look as if, for going forward, I want it to look internally as if they're going to /node/5, because that's the real URL to this page internally. They just had a cute little alias. Second listener, so that was the first listener, that's all it did. Second listener, router listener. What's cool about the router listener, this is actually the exact same router listener that runs inside of Symfony Framework. And the only difference, really, between Symfony or Silex routing system and Drupal's routing system is that Drupal stores its routes in the database, whereas in Silex, you physically write them out and say, I have this page, I have this page, I have this page. So Drupal has a big database table, which last time I checked is called router. And it just basically queries for all those and has a nice, efficient way of matching which of those routes matched. And then once it figures out which route matched, you guys remember, let's see. No, I won't say it that way. Once it's figured out what route has matched, just like in Silex, what does that give us? In the case of Drupal, it gives us three things. You remember in Silex a second ago, it gave us underscore controller, which was set to the anonymous function. This is the controller to call. In Drupal, you get three things. You get this underscore content, which is actually this is a function name. Again, this is just a class name, colon, then a function name. So in Silex, we get an underscore controller. In Drupal, we get an underscore content. But they're kind of similar in the same idea. It's sort of like this is where you can go to go and build that page, to go and basically render that node. It also gives you a title callback, and it also gives you like the node itself. So again, if you're at /node/5, it's going to go look up the data for node 5 in the database and give you this object that's kind of populated with all of its data. Okay? So that route in there knows basically that inside of Drupal, if you're looking for a node, that node is rendered by this function. So in theory, you could actually change that in Drupal in the database. You could say, no, when nodes are rendered, they're actually rendered by this other function, because it's all just kind of a normal route. Third listener, very simple, called the content controller subscriber. What it does is, this is a little bit of a simplification, or well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. What it basically does is figure out what is the user rendering. What does the client want to render? Does it want to render does it want HTML? Does it want JSON? Does it want HTML, but HTML that's being used for AJAX, so like not a full body page? It kind of determines that and sets an underscore controller key based on that value. The idea here is, and I'm going to show you guys how this all hooks up in a second. The idea here is that there's different functions that are good at rendering HTML and other functions that are better at rendering other types of data. Because we all know, like in a perfect RESTful world now, we have this idea of data. We don't have idea of HTML pages anymore. We have this idea of data. And then that data can be given to us as HTML or JSON in this other format, or XML. So this is kind of saying, for this, what they want, you can go out to this function, and it's going to help you with the HTML. Cool. So I'm going to come back to those. All we've done is basically stash some random strings onto the request attributes. So again, there's another event called kernel.controller. Nobody cares about him. And then, just like inside of Symfony, we're going to call the function. So far, it's exactly the same as Symfony and Silex. It's the event. It just had 3 different listeners. And by the time we get here, we just have some request attributes that have been set by those listeners. For Silex and Symfony, it was just underscore controller, and it just called that, and it was game over, and that was it. Inside of Drupal, it's a little bit different because you've populated with a few other things. But the first step's the same. The first step is that you look up underscore controller, and you just call that. And what it's expecting back from that, this is a bit of a simplification, but what it's expecting back from that, of course, is a response object, because this is what's going to build the page. Inside of that function, so notice we're inside the HTML page controller content function. Inside that content function, it's passed those other values, the underscore content, the underscore title callback, and the actual node object that was queried for it. And again, I'm not going to go through this, and this is a simplification, but it's exactly like, it's just really, really simple at its core. It says, okay, if this is the controller. This is supposed to return a response. So what it's going to actually do first is call the underscore content function. So if I go back here again, remember this is what we looked up from the routing in the database, and it said to render this type of page, you should call this function. So the first thing it does is it goes and calls that function. And what it returns in a philosophical sense basically is something that represents that node. It's not HTML, it's not JSON, it's just data. Here's that node object in data format. It hasn't been presented in anything yet. Once we have that, since we're inside of the HTML controller, because it determined that we actually want HTML back, it goes and basically takes that content, turns it into HTML. It even calls that title callback, because that was another little spot where it says you can control the page title. So it even calls that title callback, which is not that important. And ultimately returns a response object. Again, I'm squeezing a few layers together here. But ultimately returns a response object, and this Drupal render page is Drupal's, well, as far as I understand, Drupal's theming system taking hold. Yeah, fair enough. So we took this simple idea of we have a route matches a controller builds a response, and we just added some extra layers on top of it, because of course Drupal is much more complex than Silex is. But it's all of those layers fitting into the same thing. This is just a normal Symfony or Silex style controller. It's just doing some content-specific stuff inside of it to kind of build a different page. Now, of course, after this, we have another event. Nobody's listening to that. And then we send the response back. By the way, how did I know? I don't know if this is going to be clear. This is not meant to be readable anyways. There we go. How did I know all of this was happening? Like, how the heck would you ever know that like this is happening and like this listener is called and that subscriber is called? Like, it is difficult to trace this stuff through. Inside of Symfony, Silex, and Drupal, there is, it's not built into all of them. It's built into Symfony. There's something called a web profiler. And if you install it, you get something that looks like this. So this is part of Drupal's web profiler. Basically means if you refresh any page, you can kind of go into that page and see a graph of what happened on that page. So this is literally saying, this profile listener was called first, then this path subscriber was called, then this was called, then this was called, then this was called. So if you wanted to actually dive deeper into this stuff and see what was going on, that's how you would actually do it. Well, that's actually how I did it. So let's talk about Laravel. Perfect. So it's always the odd man out, but it sort of isn't the odd man out. So before we were talking about a single function called handle, a single concrete function that had all these bells and whistles inside of it to drive Silex, Symfony, and Drupal, even though it was the same 40 lines of concrete code for all of those things. So what Laravel does is it has a different handle function. It still has the same input. There you go. It still has the same input, which is the request, and the same output, which is the response. Because you'll notice it implements the HTTP kernel interface, which is the same interface that that other handle method basically implements. So it's still the same input and the same output. So this is really important. Even though it's going to do something different at its core, like how it does the routing controller is going to be different, it's actually still the same input and same output. There's still a handle function that does the same thing. So this is how it's going to look inside of Laravel. Again, this is exactly almost copy and paste from a slide earlier. Might do, boop, there we go. This is basically copy and paste from a slide earlier, except instead of events being done here, there's going to be something that we call middleware. And it's going to work sort of the same exact way, so it's kind of a different strategy. But it's still request, router, controller, response. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Oops. Cool. All right, so step one, the same, request. I'm not going to talk about that. We've seen that slide many times. The point I'm trying to drive home, it's the same darn thing over and over again. It's just that request. Now again, what happens immediately in the beginning of the request in Laravel? There's a middleware. I haven't explained that yet, but you can think of it as like a hook where somebody that's not the framework can do something that we, the framework, don't know about or care about. So there's a middleware that happens. What happens after the middleware? That's where we get into the handle function. Okay, and what does the handle function do? It's actually fairly simple in Laravel. The handle function basically calls the router, figures out which function matched, and then calls that function. So route equals this find route. It gets this route object back, and it says route run, which actually calls the function that's attached to that route. So the same idea as Symfony. Symfony and Silex drop this out into two different steps. There's like a routing layer, and then like 10 milliseconds later, there's like something else that executes the function. So these are pushed a little bit closer together in Laravel, but it's exactly the same idea going inside of here. And this is actually what happens inside of their kernel handle function. So the middleware is actually something that's before the kernel handle function. I'll show that in a second. So at this point, we've built the response. It's just route controller. What happens after that? More middleware things, which you may or may not understand yet. It's not important. And then, of course, we just send the response, which is sending the headers and echoing the content, which is the same thing that's happened at the bottom of every framework. So here's the thing about the middlewares, and this is kind of why it's kind of cool that Laravel does something different, at least for purposes of us sitting here for the next few minutes and learning something interesting. Laravel uses something called a middleware, which is actually also something I was just talking with Larry that Drupal is using in Drupal 8, even though I didn't show it here. So here's the handle function inside of Laravel. So before we went through the Symfony Silex thing, this was the handle function. And I said there's an event, and then there's this, and there's an event, and there's this, there's an event. It's like this. In Laravel, the handle function is actually very, very small. And the only thing inside of it is that routing controller dance that we saw. So it's just this little thing here. And what we do is we kind of wrap that mini handle function in other handle functions. So it's going to look like this. So let's say I have I want to do some sort of authentication. Because you notice like the handle function didn't have anything about authentication inside of it. And it didn't have any hooks inside of it. It was just routing controller, no way to hook inside of that. So let's say we do need to add some sort of authentication. Your middleware, this is an example of a middleware function, is going to look something like this. It has a handle function, which has the same input request and output response. And basically, when we execute our framework, instead of calling handle on Laravel's actual handle function, we're going to call handle on this guy first. He's going to do some stuff before the request, and then actually pass handle, or I should say, call the handle function on Laravel's actual core. And of course, that returns a response because it does the whole routing controller thing internally. You get back the response, and then we can do some stuff with the response, basically after the request has been done. So it kind of wraps it. So we can't get into, I mean, there are other ways to get into it, but the point is, from this model, it's not like you're trying to break into that handle function. You're just doing things before and after the handle function, and actually like a really neat kind of way. So a real quick example of this would be like a rate limiter. So at the top of this like, we have a framework. We call the handle function on this guy here. And the first thing we're going to do is basically check. I'm not going to go through this too much. We're going to check to see if the current user has made over 60 requests to our API over some certain amount of time. If he has, we're just going to return a new response. If he hasn't, we're actually going to call handle on Laravel's core here. So what's cool here is if they've gone over their limit, we never actually pass the request into Laravel. We are like, no, it's not going in there. The core is not even going to know this ever happened. I'm just going to return a response right now, and we're done. If you actually want to pass it in, then you call this app handle. Of course, you get the response back because it does the whole routing controller thing. And then you have the opportunity, which is kind of cool, to actually modify the response. So you can set a header on it that says, this is how many requests you have left over the next hour or something like that. So here's the key takeaway from this, is I want to basically juxtapose. So everything so far has been the same. The requests are the same. The responses are the same. The routing system is the same. It's all the same, until we got to the core of this handle function. Then I was like, things are a little bit different. But they're not as different as you think. So kind of keep this in mind, how we did this, how we accomplished this. Inside of Symfony or Drupal or Silex, it's accomplished in a different way technically, but it's going to look very familiar. So again, this is exactly what we saw earlier. This here, this big thing, is actually the handle function. And then we have events that happen inside of that. So we're actually hooking inside of the handle function instead of wrapping around the handle function. That's kind of the philosophical difference. And what it means is that if we want to do that exact same thing inside of Symfony, Drupal, or Silex, and actually I should say this, because they all have the same core, which is that handle function from HTTP kernel, even though Symfony and Silex don't have the middleware system, you can actually add it onto the middleware system. And in fact, if you have a middleware which is used in Drupal, that's technically compatible with Laravel or Symfony or Silex. So there's still this layer of compatibility, and the middleware system can apply to all of them. But the middleware potential aside inside of Symfony or Silex, this is how it looks. Okay? First, we listen to the first function, that's listening to the kernel.request event. Remember, that's the event that happens right in the beginning of the request being handled, and we do the first part. And if they're over the limit, we actually create a response object. We call event set response. I'm missing an argument here. That should be $response. But basically, this is the first part. And then down here, this is listening to kernel.response, which is the event at the end of the whole flow, and we just do the second half of things. So it's really the same idea. We just have to hook into two different events instead of kind of like calling the internal function and putting some code above it and some code below it. Two different philosophies. They both have their pros and their cons. I actually like the middleware one, even though I'm more familiar with this one. But you're going to accomplish the same thing. Also, the response objects, the request objects, the understanding of the flow itself is all the same. So you'll notice even though I have kind of a different feel here with two functions, most of this code here is basically copy and paste from the Laravel one, because it's the same request object, it's the same response object, we're accomplishing the same thing. Cool. I have just a couple minutes left, so I want to talk about services. So last important thing, so we have request, response, controller, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is basically exactly the same or slightly different. So the last thing is that all of these frameworks have the idea of services. I think most people in this room understand services. It's a useful object. So when I say service, think of useful object, like something that sends emails. That would be a useful object. The way that you access, sorry, Larry. I actually thought about putting your name here. The way that you access the services, they all have services, and this is actually one spot where each of those different 4 frameworks use a different library for their service container. The only exception being Symfony and Drupal actually use the same service container. But that doesn't matter because they all work exactly the same. So we're not sharing as much as this in this part of the tech stack as other parts that we've seen, but they all work exactly the same way. So in Drupal, if you want to incur Larry's wrath, you would get to a service using this way. And the point is that there's basically a central object called a container, and you ask the container for the service who's called logger. So this would be something where you'd read Drupal's documentation. This is actually not real code. You'd read Drupal's documentation. It would say, hey, we have a service called logger. And you'd be like, oh, you do? OK, thanks. Let me get that out of the container and start doing work with it. In Silex, you get it with app left square bracket logger. But then this returns to you an object. In fact, the same object potentially that you have inside of Drupal. You call the same method on it. Inside of Symfony, typically it looks like this arrow container arrow get logger. And then you call the same method on it. And inside of Laravel, it's a facade. It looks like this, which is, we mentioned facades earlier. This is actually a shortcut that says go get the logger service out of the container and then call the non-static info method on it. So behind the scenes, it actually looks a whole lot like that. There's just that extra layer of magic. So even though they're all using different container libraries, they all work exactly the same way. It's just like, the question is not, how do I do something, or somebody explain how you handle objects in whatever system you're doing. All of these have a container which holds useful objects. The only question you need to ask is, in Drupal or in Symfony or in Laravel, how do I access services? Oh, in Symfony, if you want a service called logger, you do it this way. Oh, in Drupal, if you want a service called logger, you access it this way. And then after that, it's the exact same code. One of the nice things on top of this, in reality, is at least in Silex, Symfony, and Laravel, I'm not sure this is the case of Drupal, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, they all actually use the same logging library. So once you've figured out how to get the logger service in each of those, you're actually passed an identical object from a library called monologue, which is kind of cool. Yeah, Larry? Oh yeah, good. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So they're not. Drupal doesn't use monologue, but this is another beautiful thing about what the PHP community is doing. They are using a library that implements the same logger interface as monologue. So even though in Drupal you'd be using a different logger, you would actually have no idea because you'd be calling these same methods on it. So yeah, very, very good. So the point is, we still have this request response. Let me pop that up here. Request, router, controller, all this stuff is exactly the same. We have a container object floating around here. We're going to ask the container object for a service. It's going to give us that object back. And then it's exactly the kind of same stuff after that. If we wanted to create our own service, I'm going to show this very quickly because I'm just about out of time, but that's good because I'm just about out of slides. If we wanted to create our own service instead of using an existing one, it's just the same exact thing. So we have this translator. It has a construct argument called language, like which language we want to translate things into. I'm just inventing this. This is just some made-up class. Instead of Drupal and Symfony, if you want to register that as a service inside the container, it looks like this. Give it a class key, give it arguments, and that's how you do it. Inside Silex, it looks like this. Again, there's the class name, there's the arguments. So you can see there's just different flavors of teaching your framework how to put a service into the container. Like this is just syntax difference, basically. And then in both cases, you end up with a container that has a service in it called myTranslator. And then inside of Laravel, I think this is even a little bit different inside of Laravel 5, where there's some new tools, I think, with Laravel 5. But it's the exact same thing. You're like, oh, I have something called myTranslator, and it's this object, and that's it. So again, just like driving that point home, we're like, these are all exactly the same patterns, even though the syntax is slightly different. So okay, so we're coming back out of this. We went all the way down to handle, and things were a bit complicated down there. Coming all the way back, so the point is like almost everything between these libraries is shared. And this is really, really great for you guys and all of the people that you will run out of this room and go spread the word to. Because the whole purpose of giving this talk is that if you understand one of these tools, then you understand in great degree all of the other tools as well. So I don't have any tool in my toolkit for doing a CMS. I just don't do CMSs. But in this world of Drupal 8 coming out, I actually do. So Drupal 8 is actually something that's been added to my toolkit. Laravel is something that's been added to my toolkit for free, or maybe not for free, but for like incredibly discounted. So it's not like I need to go learn some completely different tech stack now, because I have the same exact tech stack. And so I can leverage a lot more things. So if you know one of these, you know all of them. Because we have the same request object, okay, a little sugar there, but we all know that's the same thing. We have the same response object, facade, same response object. We have the same routing system. In fact, Laravel has a slightly different magic on theirs, but very, very small difference. We have the same routing system, just different syntax. By the way, it's actually using the same routing component behind the scenes. And even the framework itself is all kind of following that same pattern. And of course, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. The only difference was the idea of, do we have the middlewares or do we have kind of the events? Like, there's two different ways to hook into the core framework process. But once you're hooking into that process, it's all the same request to response kind of flow. And then the container, even though it's different libraries, are all the same idea. Get a service out of the container and then start using it. And all four of these libraries effectively have the same logger. How incredible is that? That has nothing to do with Symfony or any of this. That's just the PHP world kicking butt for us. So at the end of this, and actually have other libraries listed up here. If you've got the response, request, routing, controller, HTTP kernel thing, if this is making sense to you, if you're feeling comfortable with this, like, you've unlocked a whole bunch of tools. Yes, the 4 tools that I talked about, I can actually go into Drupal as if I'm a core developer and start ripping out the core. It makes sense to me. That's amazing because I don't know anything about Drupal. But there's other things like PHPBB uses a ton of Symfony components. Easy Publish is built on the framework. Oral Platform, which by the way is a fantastic open source tool built by the creators of Magento. If you have a CRM, some sort of application that needs lots of complex users and user management and scheduling and appointments, some system that kind of starts with those features and then you're doing some custom development off of that, check out Oral Platform. It's built on the Symfony Framework, open source, and it has all these amazing tools kind of built into it. So that's it. And the kind of takeaway is, go try these. Go dive into the core. Go see how they're different. Even if you don't use them, like when I dive into Drupal, whether or not I ever have a need to use Drupal, I understand a lot more about what I do. And go pass the word on everybody else. Like, if you're in the Laravel community, be like, hey, did you know Laravel is using all the same stuff as Drupal 8? So that'd be cool when that comes out, in case you have a need for it. Like, that might be a good thing to check out, because your life's going to be a lot easier than using, no offense to anybody in the room, using Joomla, which is going to have less in common with what your tech stack is normally used to. So that is it, and thank you guys very much. Awesome, and thanks for sticking with my colored switch there. Comments or questions or comments, because we have an interesting group of people in the room. Larry.
Just a lot of the details of the Drupal routing part are changing as soon as the patch gets submitted.
Oh, yeah. I'm actually surprised that you didn't say they already changed, because my Drupal information is coming from about 4 or 5 months ago.
We had a discussion about a month ago, some of that's changing considerably, and as of last night, we haven't been committed yet.
What is changing?
HTML fragments
Mm-hmm.
is going away, and we're using regular arrays more directly for that.
Okay, yeah, so still philosophically, it's still kind of the same. It's still the same.
Just a lot of the intermediary pieces.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Awesome. Anybody else? Anything from the Laravel side back there? Happy? Did I represent things fairly? Good.
Like you said, it's good writing an application. It's going to look different.
Yeah, totally.
It kind of has a different style with Laravel. So, but yeah, that's a good, good representation.
Yeah, because like for me, right, if I was writing Laravel, because I come from the Symfony world, I would add my use statement in my controller and then say like new response. But like Laravel, you're going to say response : make, or view. Is it view make? View : make, which is still facade that goes out and renders a template, puts that into response object and returns it. So yeah, when you go and actually look at Laravel applications or other applications, you might be like, that doesn't look like what Ryan showed us. But in fact, like just dive one layer deep and you're going to be like, that is exactly the same thing behind the scenes. Yep.
Actually, you skipped over the slide on Stack PHP. You've got some time to talk about that.
Oh, good, yeah, because it was too early. Let me just get one of those slides up. Very good. So this whole idea of middleware is not something that Laravel invented. This is effectively the slide. It's fine. So this actual even image is from a library called StackPHP, and I'm going to talk about this for like 1 minute. StackPHP is a library, standalone library, that wraps the HTTP kernel interface, so in other words, wraps the handle function, and basically gives you this magic. So the whole idea Like, how does Laravel manage the idea of like me wrapping a middleware handle function around it, and somebody else wrapping a handle function around me, and somebody else wrapping a handle function around me? Who's handling this whole setup and the passing of each layer into it and then the passing back up? It's actually a library called stack.php. So if you are using something that uses one of these cores, Laravel's already using stack.php. If you're using Symfony Framework, you could actually also use stack.php. And when you do that, it means that any of the existing middlewares that live out there for stack.php, you can use. Maybe directly, maybe not directly, but basically all of the middlewares are compatible with each other because all these middlewares, like if you have a middleware like, obviously like, let me think, like, oh, here's a good one. Like a session middleware, that's actually one of the ones that's out. There's a session middleware, which actually helps you kind of like start the session and close down the session afterwards. That can be used across any of those frameworks. It's something that you can plug in because all of those frameworks are using the handle function, so you can use the middleware to basically plug that session in. And since they're all also using the same request object and the same response object, it's going to operate the same way. So I don't know if that kind of does it justice or not, but it's the magic behind all this middleware stuff. Laravel, it's not some crazy thing Laravel invented. Laravel actually just used an existing really nice component out there. Cool. All right, good. So stay tuned now for all the people to get up here and round table it out about this stuff. And if they disagree on something, can't you be like, hey, I thought you guys were friends. Hold on a second, I just saw a presentation before this that said you all get along and agree.